Current avian influenza virus strains have been circulating and diversifying in wild bird populations for at least the last 100 years. The practice of exterminating animals to prevent disease spread, with government compensation, has been in use for centuries. Yet, with the advent of PCR testing, the risk of false positives can lead to unnecessary animal exterminations.
If they could find this virus in you at all, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. But it doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that.
Since the H5N1 bird flu outbreak began in late 2020, millions of healthy chickens have been culled in an attempt to prevent spread. The conventional practice involves culling all of the birds in a facility in which the virus is detected. The frequently stated rationale for this practice is that highly pathogenic avian influenza has a mortality rate of 90% of domesticated poultry, often within 48 hours, so that one might as well destroy the entire flock and start over with an entirely new one. Often using inhumane methods such as ventilation shutdown.
Ventilation shutdown is the killing of animals by shutting off vents to basically suffocate animals. Ventilation shutdown plus adds carbon dioxide or heat, which only increases the suffering of the animals.
Or foam depopulation, which involves spraying birds with foam to suffocate them. The U.S. government incentivizes this practice, known as depop, by reimbursing the farmer for all culled birds, but not for birds that die of influenza. Because this has long been the conventional practice, there is zero financial motive to wait and see if the virus is indeed as pathogenic as claimed. Currently, there is an urgent need to conduct research on the alternative practice of waiting to see if some percentage of the flock survives and develops herd immunity. The unnecessary culling of millions of healthy animals can lead to food supply chain collapse, resulting in catastrophic consequences.
Its latest news report, the USDA shows large egg prices around the nation have jumped.
Melbourne shoppers are being told to brace for egg supply shortages for up to a year as the bird flu crisis unfolds.
It's thought it's families with children who are struggling the most. As this graph shows, since April, food insecurity has increased more amongst this group compared to households without children.
Scientific evidence shows that culling entire flocks may not be necessary, as H5N1 doesn't kill every chicken it infects. Instead, flocks should be given a chance to recover and obtain natural immunity against the virus. Studies on this observation method are urgently needed to prevent millions of unnecessary animal deaths. As was recently reported in the New York Times, some animal welfare advocates, pointing to recent outbreaks that were allowed to run their course, question whether killing every bird on an affected farm is even the right approach. When H5N1 hit Harvest Home Animal Sanctuary in California in February 2023, killing 3 birds, the farm's operators steeled themselves for a state-mandated culling. Instead, California agriculture officials, citing a recently created exemption for farms that do not produce food, said they would spare the birds as long as strict quarantine measures were put in place for 120 days. Over the next few weeks, the virus claimed 26 of the farm's 160 chickens, ducks, and turkeys, but the others survived, even those that had appeared visibly ill, according to Christine Morrissey, the sanctuary's executive director. She said the experience suggested that mass cullings might be unnecessary. There needs to be more research and effort put into finding other ways of responding to this virus, Ms. Morrissey said, because depopulation is horrifying and it's not solving the problem at hand. Cattle currently exhibit a very low mortality rate from H5N1, yet unscrupulous actors might push for policies that mandate the culling of infected cows.
Nobody knows how to get rid of
how to get cows to stop farting.
Exactly, or burping. And so there is artificial meat. If it was a 50% reduction, then you could ignore, okay, leave the cows alone. But because we're trying to avoid the temperature continuing to go up, you do need to go to zero. We need to change cows, just cows alone.
How are we going to do that?
Well, we'll have to prepare for the next one. That, I'd say is will get attention this time.
We know what's next. We're going to have zoonotic influenza illness. So, put your tray tables in the upright position and your seats forward and your seatbelts on, because this is unfortunately a new wave of pandemics is going to be upon us.
I'm obviously most worried about bird flu, but in the laboratory, I could make it highly infectious for humans in months, because it's been published, the 5 amino acids that I need to change. And so I don't think that research should be done. That's the real threat. That's the real biosecurity threat, that these university labs are doing these bio experiments that are intentionally modifying viruses. And bird flu, I think, is going to be the cause of the great pandemic.
Naturally occurring HPAI, H5N1 viruses cause a reported almost 60% mortality in humans, which triggered a concern, understandably, clearly, that if you give a gain of function of a pathogenic virus to make it more transmissible, that's a whole different story. There were studies done by 2 NIAID-funded investigators, Ron Fouché and Yoshi Kawaoka, in which H5N1, a strain from Indonesia and a strain from Vietnam, were altered in a gain of function, either by direct mutation or by reassortment. And by passage in ferrets, the mammal model for this virus, for humans, there was an increase in fact, a development of aerosol transmissibility in a mammal, which this particular virus did not have. Because of that, this triggered concern. NSABB recommended that the general conclusions highlighting the novel outcome be published, but the manuscript did not include methodologic and other details that could enable replication of the experiments by those who would seek to do harm. What also was discussed that might accidentally be released.
We should be testing every cow weekly. You can do pooled PCR.
We do know that global energy systems, food systems, and supply chains will be deeply affected.
The Gates Foundation gave $9.5 million to UW-Madison and principal investigator Yoshihiro Kawaka to modify H5N1 viruses to preferentially recognize human type receptors and transmit efficiently in mammals. The current USDA Deputy Chief of Staff is a former Gates Foundation Senior Program Officer for Private Sector Partnerships. Her former employer wishes to transition meat consumption to 100% synthetic. In 2023, the USDA approved Bill Gates-backed laboratory-made chicken created by Upside Foods. Serial passage, gain of function, of H5NX clade 2.3.4.4 viruses in mallard ducks is currently underway at the USDA Southeast Poultry Research Laboratory in Athens, Georgia. We are highly suspicious that H5N1 clade 2.3.4.4b, genotype B1, may have leaked or was released from the USDA Southeast Poultry Research Laboratory, leading to the current outbreaks.
In review of this video that we've just watched, I think it breaks down neatly into 6 areas of concern. Doctor, what is your current thinking here on June the 16th with area of concern 1, culling?
The goal of culling was to eradicate avian influenza, to just snuff it out. Well, this is, the genie's out of the bottle here, John. This is spreading from hen house to hen house. At this point in time, I think culling ought to be challenged, and farmers should consider not culling all their birds. Remember, that disrupts their workflow, particularly egg-laying hens, which have no contact with any other birds. That'd be the first group I would suggest not culling, and to look at survival from the current strain of avian influenza.
You know, this whole enterprise of culling comports with the Great Reset agenda of reducing human consumption of animal protein. I think that's something we should be aware of, particularly as we examine point number 2 in this. The purported expansion of the host range of this virus into mammals, most notably marine mammals and cattle. We've seen in the video that Mr. Bill Gates and some of his Great Reset companions would like to reduce human consumption of beef. What are your thoughts about this purported expansion of the latest clades host range into mammals?
In a review by Abdul Wade and colleagues, to just orient our viewers, humans can get influenza A, B, and C. Okay, birds can get influenza A. Now, beyond that, influenza B, pigs and seals. Additionally, influenza C, pigs. Influenza D in cattle. But we haven't seen influenza A go into these other species. And John, it suggests the work of potentially gain of function research through serial passage to get it to pass from a bird potentially to a mammal. And we're highly suspicious that this could have occurred at the USDA Poultry Research Center in Athens, Georgia, or in academic laboratories all over the world. But expanded host range is unlikely to have occurred in nature without human agency.
What are we to make of these reports, which are very alarming? We see reports illustrated with photographs of multiple dead elephant seals as far south as Tierra del Fuego, or harbor seals in Massachusetts. We're seeing increasing reports of this. We all know that marine mammals are closer to humans. How are we supposed to interpret these alarming reports of dead marine mammals?
If we saw these 10 or 20 years ago, the putative cause could have been a toxic algae bloom or some other cause. I wouldn't trust the PCR test alone. Scientists using the PCR test on dead animals, the virus could be there, just coexisting, may not be pathogenic. We really need to see autopsies of these animals in chest x-rays and really understand, did they have a mammalian form of bird flu or did they not? We simply can't trust the PCR alone.
Okay, let's briefly touch on this questionable proposition that along with expanded or increased transmissibility and host range, we're also seeing increased virulence. This seems to fly in the face of conventional virology theory. Any thoughts on that?
You know, this was our third point, John. And it goes back to the work of Theobald Smith, 1904, who said, listen, if a virus is going to survive, it can't kill all of its hosts. It's never going to be able to transmit. So as it moves from host to host, it's got to keep some of the hosts alive. And so it can't be that virulent. Otherwise, the existence of the virus would, in a sense, it would terminate itself. Now that moves all the way forward to what we saw through the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak, where, as COVID just existed, over the course of years, even to today, we saw what's called Mueller's ratchet, that as the virus moves through its evolutionary outbreak course, it becomes less virulent. And COVID is a less serious infection. Interestingly, with SARS-1 and MERS, it had reduced human-to-human transmission, but a lot more virulence. And so those two outbreaks burned out on their own, but COVID continues. So the concern here is that with the current strain of bird flu, is that it is propagating across the country, but our careful observation is that we're not seeing large numbers of dead birds, for instance, at ponds or on farms. We're not hearing about large numbers of bird deaths in zoos, which we would hear about that with other viral infections like West Nile virus, for example. So, I think at this point in time, my gut feeling is that the current strain circulating is more transmissible, but less serious, less deadly.
Okay, point number 4 is something that we've been talking about a lot. It would seem that the probable goal of this media campaign about this new clade of H5N1 bird flu is fear-mongering with a likely objective of unloading lots of new H5N1 vaccines on the governments of the world. That seems to be the game afoot. Any thoughts on how this could be just a matter of fear-mongering with the objective of selling vaccines to governments?
And boy, our government is already involved in this. Peter Marks, who directs this area within the NIH, has been on Capitol Hill saying the U.S. already has 3 vaccines. They have the CSL Audens antigen-based vaccine. They must be alluding to the CSL self-replicating messenger RNA vaccine and the CEPI Gates Foundation Korean self-amplifying messenger RNA vaccines. Now, these are all vaccines for humans, and we haven't seen large numbers of human cases. Despite that, John, fear has driven the European Union to pull the trigger on 40 million vaccine doses of bird flu for humans. I thoroughly expect our U.S. government is shortly announcing a large purchase of human vaccines in the United States. And we'll see, for instance, Neerav Shah, our CDC director, who's already advising mass PCR testing of farm workers. Before you know it, I believe both the CDC and FDA will be advising mass vaccination of farm workers and others in this fear-driven frenzy that leads to mass human vaccination.
Yes, and just to add, we've seen in China mass vaccination of domesticated poultry. And as the recent paper out of the University of Georgia points out, the preceding variant to the latest, H5NX, it was called, there's quite a bit of evidence that mutation, that variant, actually emerged as a direct result of mass vaccinating poultry in China with a leaky vaccine. That is to say, it did not prevent transmission and infection. So I think that the evidence we're looking at thus far suggests that any kind of mass vaccination, whether it be animals or humans, is not indicated at this point. We look at number 5, and I think this is the wild card: gain of function, laboratory manipulation of this virus, of this latest variant. We've seen this is the hot topic to this day on Capitol Hill with respect to SARS-CoV-2. The thing that I'm observing here is we've already talked about this current clade seems to have been manipulated in a lab to amplify its transmissibility and its host range. There's also concern that we saw in our video with the possibility that the kinds of experiments that Fouchier and Kawaoka were performing that did cause alarm. The question is, has this kind of work been resumed? Can this kind of work pose a more specific threat to human health? What are your thoughts about gain of function?
The video clearly shows Anthony Fauci describing the goals of gain of function research by Dr. Kawaoka in Wisconsin, Dr. Ron Fouchier at Erasmus in the Netherlands, were in their papers, and I've read it. They're essentially, their goal is to get human-to-human spread. Fauci thinks it's so dangerous that the methods of their papers should not be disclosed. So those with nefarious intentions could not, in a sense, create another biological threat. But Redfield, former CDC director, says that is the imminent threat, John. The imminent threat is a strain that can jump from human to human. And everybody should be watching for reports where this is happening, John. Gain of function research looks like it's up to no good across the board. We previously had a pause on gain of function research just on federal funding, 2014 to 2017, John, but that's not enough. Gain of function research on US soil, in my view, should be completely banned. We should have no more of it. Our institutional review boards and similar bodies should reject any of these proposals. There should be no funding for this research, not just federal, but all forms of funding. I think gain of function research is going to dial up another global pandemic.
Well, and you mentioned U.S. soil. Remember, the poultry laboratory in Athens, Georgia, announced in 2021 they're not only performing these experiments in their lab in Athens, Georgia. Their research partner in China is part of this same endeavor. So here we are once again. We have American biotechnicians working with their colleagues in China. So I would go one step further. American biotechnology cannot be transferred to Chinese colleagues either.
It's true. We really need a global ban on gain of function research, and it needs to have some real bite to it, John. We're talking federal fines or imprisonment for the exchange of this type of very dangerous biotechnology. It's almost like transferring knowledge on the development of a nuclear weapon or something worse.
Number 6, the importance of being prepared. As if we've learned nothing in the last 4 years, it's difficult to predict how these things are going to play out, especially when we're talking about the wild card of human manipulation and agency. Tell us about the importance of being prepared.
Our analysis right now, John, and no one really knows what's going to happen, but I think this is the best distillation, that preparedness for bird flu is not animal vaccination. It's not human vaccination. It's not hazmat suits or masks. It's actually being prepared if one has direct contact or gets sick with highly pathogenic avian influenza. We're talking about dilute iodine nasal sprays and gargles every 4 hours. A very dilute iodine drop can be made at home that's safe. And because we know the eyes have been a source of acquisition of the virus, at least in the small number of human cases so far, which have been non-serious. We have oral antivirals like Tamiflu and 3 others, even an intravenous one, and the ability to cover for secondary infections with antibiotics. We've never had a human death of bird flu in America. That's because we have very good treatments for influenza. I believe the stated previous human mortality rate from avian influenza largely is a reflection of very poor standards of medical care in Southeast Asia, where most of the cases have arisen, John. So preparedness, again, means the use of nasal sprays, gargles, drops as a way to, in a sense, neutralize the virus after contact and reduce the viral burden with infection. And then we move on to standard of care influenza treatment.
And you mentioned earlier the importance of antibiotics for secondary bacterial infections. That seems to have been a real killer in the Spanish flu.
Yeah, that is certainly true. Influenza uniquely sets up the body for a staphylococcal pneumonia. You may wonder, where does the staph come? Large numbers of people have staphylococcus in their nasal passages. So as they inhale, the staphylococcal bacteria can go down to damaged lungs with influenza and cause staphylococcal pneumonia. I've seen it in my clinical practice, and it's a serious form of pneumonia. It needs antibiotics to treat it.
Well, I'd like to conclude by saying that this is an investigation in progress. As an old true crime investigator, I can say that it's a process. We continue to examine every element of this. We will update regularly on our McCullough Foundation Twitter account, on Substack, and on our McCullough Foundation website. Doctor, thank you so much for this analysis.
Thank you.